Welcome to another week of our journey together as we deal with the questions that you have posed to me and the statements that you have shared with me about faith. Let me begin our time together this week with this quote from one of you. Quote, Bruce, how do I know if the things I've done in my life are according to God's directions and not just what makes me happy? I am so sorry there were so many wasted years of my life due to my anger. And I'm not sure why I was so mad. But after I asked God to forgive me, life has been a joy-filled trip ever since. What a wonderful statement and question to follow up on last week's consideration of being afraid to die. This week we explored last week what it meant to die in faith. This week we explore what it means to live in faith. And the beautiful nature of the statement that I just read from one of you is that in sharing that personal journey of faith, one of you included the answer. This person, in sharing a journey of faith, discovered the miracle of forgiveness. The experience of forgiveness turned a life of anger into a life of joy. Well, some of you have heard the story when I was in Liberia during the reign and occupation of the rebels. I was to preach my first sermon the next day, and I had not prepared anything but asked to meet with the lay leaders of the conference. And with them I asked, what message do you need tomorrow? They were shocked that I would ask. They thought I had something in my hip pocket that I would preach. They quickly huddled with each other and came back with the unanimous request. We beg of you to preach about forgiveness. Forgive and forget is not working for us. For 24 hours I struggled and feebly preached to a huge crowd, probably 1,500 people, about forgiveness. Some of these people had walked 2 weeks just to get to the conference, to be able to share their faith with each other. I preached a sermon entitled, Remember and Forgive. Trying to take on what they said didn't work. Forgive and forget. I shared that forgiveness was not a prelude to forgetting. Rather, remembering is a prelude to forgiveness. Remember and forgive. Well, the sermon I preached was met with stone cold silence. No reaction of any kind. All those people sitting there in silence. It's been described to me later on at least 15 or 20 minutes. And Arthur Coolaw, Bishop Coolaw, who had invited me to Liberia, was sitting next to me and patted me on the knee and said, "It's okay, Bruce. The Spirit is preaching." I'd never heard that phrase before. The Spirit is preaching. But all of a sudden, that silence was broken. when a middle-aged man I had never met came to the front of that open-air arena for worship and shared this statement. A year ago, my wife and children were murdered by the rebels right before my very eyes. I anticipated I would be killed next. Instead of killing me, they laughed as they left me alone, alive, to be forced to remember the murder of my family. I know rebels are here today. You're spying what's happening in this place. I want to address you, the rebel spies among us. Today, I am forgiving you. For the past year, I have tried to forget, and for the past year, I have moved further and further away from God as I continued to try to forget. Anger and resentment has been my life for the last year. Today, I want to tell you, rebels, that my madness of what you did to my family is no longer going to control my life. Your action is no longer going to come between me and my God. I remember what you did, but as I have been forgiven, I forgive you. He turned and came to me. As we embraced, he whispered, "My first smile in a year." And he turned to the worshipers of the day with a smile on his face, and the congregation stood and chanted for minutes on end, "God is so good. God is so good today." Now, the story of one of you who had the experience of forgiveness, turning your life of anger to a life of joy, and your comrade in faith, the man in Liberia who had the same experience of anger and resentment being replaced by the joy expressing the smile on his face. Both stories put forth to us some truth about forgiveness. First of all, a forgiving person does not dwell on what has been done, but is captured by what is to become. Secondly, forgiveness is the prevailing attitude of agape love. A forgiving person is never called on to approve what another has done, but rather accepts the reality of what has been done and refuses to allow past actions of another to govern their life rather than being governed by agape love. Thirdly, to refuse to forgive leaves one with the attitude of anger and resentment, which in the life of one of you who wrote to me that question, and my friend in Liberia, indeed, When we abandon agape love, controlled by a life of anger and resentment, we find ourselves distancing from the God of agape love. Day by day, anger and resentment can create distance between ourselves and our God. So, in answer to the question of the week, how do we know if what I've done in my life is according to God's direction? My response simply is that God's way is a way of forgiveness. Jesus talked more about forgiveness than anything else. And when they said, "How many times do we have to forgive, Jesus?" He said 70 times 70, which in Hebrew numerology is infinity. You forgive over and over again. You see, the man in Liberia and one of us at Grace Church have discovered that forgiveness is not just for the benefit of the one who is forgiven, but forgiveness is for the benefit of the forgiver. For to live a life of joy is to remember what happened, not to approve it, but forgive. And you know, as the case so often has it, the hymn writer makes that so very clear in hymn number 560. Indeed, in 1974, Fred Kahn wrote these words that we sing to a familiar hymn. Help us accept each other as Christ accepted us. Teach us as sister and brother each person to embrace. Be present, Lord, among us and bring us to believe we are ourselves accepted and meant to love and live. Oh, teach us, O Lord, your lessons as in our daily life we struggle to be human and search for hope and faith. Teach us to care for people, for all, not just for some, to love them as we find them or as they may become. Let your acceptance change us so that we may be moved in living situations to do the truth in love. To practice your acceptance until we know by heart the table of forgiveness and laughter's healing art. Lord, for today's encounters with all who are in need, who hunger for acceptance, for righteousness and bread, we need new eyes for seeing, new hands for holding on. Renew us with your Spirit. Lord, free us. Make us one. Indeed, how do we know if what we are about is according to God's direction, you ask? Jesus, the revealer of God's agape love, made it perfectly clear. Forgive, my friends. Forgive. A lot in that package to think about, and we'll talk about it Sunday, but here are some things with which we might begin. First of all, what are our stories, personal or in the life of another, of dwelling on what has been done rather than what is to become? Secondly, what is your response to the man in Liberia's witness to the rebels that he was no longer going to allow the anger over the rebels killing his family to drive a wedge between himself and God? Finally, what are your stories, personal or in the life of another, of the experience of forgiveness enabling the life of joy? Let's enjoy our week of thinking and look forward to our Sunday of visiting with each other. Thank you for listening.